By this point, I feel that we've all kind of figured out that the problem with AI implementation isn't really technical, it's more organizational. The hard part is getting your organization to actually unlock the real potential value in AI. And here I'm not talking about slapping AI onto some legacy process to get some 10% efficiency gain that will be just priced into the market in 6 months. I'm talking about innovation. But in order to get there, we quickly realized that we need to rewire mostly everything we knew about leadership and organization. And that's difficult. Therefore, I'm really proud today to welcome Jonathan Brill. He has a thing or two to say about this topic. He's been named the world's leading futurist by Forbes magazine. He's the futurist in resident at Amazon. He's been the global futurist for HP. And he just released a new book called AI and the Octopus Organization. What I love with speaking to innovators like Jonathan is that they truly understand historical patterns, they understand technology, and they understand the organizational resistance and all of the dynamics that are the more human facets of this change. Today's episode is also sponsored by Brill, and if you want to implement the type of thinking that we are discussing here on today's podcast, then head over to Brill.works to find out how. Now, let's move to the episode. Jonathan Brill, welcome.
It's amazing to be here.
For those who don't know your work, can you kind of elaborate? What is it that you do, and why does that feel interesting and important?
So my name is Jonathan Brill. I am a business futurist. I do a lot of keynote speaking. I write books, and I advise C-suites and security services around the world. My job is to help you understand what is that world that you're going to be operating in 5 years from now? Where do you need to be positioned in the next 3? What are the investments to make today? And what are the mindsets that make this all possible?
Your latest book, The Octopus Organization, you begin with an extinction event 66 million years ago. And you're not the first innovator that I've spoken to. You all seem to be kind of obsessed with history, finding repeating patterns and so forth. Can you elaborate, what is that extinction event? How does that make sense in the age of AI? And what can we learn from kind of the repeating patterns of history?
So I recently wrote a book called AI and the Octopus Organization with someone named Steve Wunker. And what we look at is what happens when the world changes? How do organizations work differently? We open the book talking about this moment 66 million years ago when a meteor hits the Earth. And all of a sudden, every animal, every plant on the planet is in a new competitive environment. And why do some thrive? And why do some fail? And we look at the octopus, and this is an amazing creature that many of the major sea creatures, the ammonite, for instance, were decimated. The octopus thrived because it was able to recode its RNA. It was able to redesign the way it worked. And in the world of artificial intelligence, we're moving into one of those meteoric events. It's going to shift the nature of firms. It's going to shift the way we work. It's going to shift the way we compete. And we can learn a whole lot from deep history, from the breadth of nature, about what types of strategies, what types of organizational structures work. And the thing about the octopus that is unique or different from many animals is you and I, we have a centralized mind. We've got a big brain up here that tells us what to do. The octopus has a distributed mind. When you look at the tentacles, each one's going this way or that way, so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden it starts to coordinate. And then all of a sudden, boom, it changes action. It goes somewhere else. There's this crazy ballet from randomness to precision. And what goes on there is that the tentacles are actually thinking, looking, exploring separately. And when one finds something, the neural tissue pushes up information into what are called the shoulders of each tentacle of the octopus, each arm of the octopus. And they talk to each other and they coordinate. And then they tell the big brain what they've just done.
Mm.
And so what happens in the octopus is that instead of information decisions going from the top down, they go from the bottom up. And it turns out to be an incredibly efficient way of innovating when it's impossible to tell your people what to do because you have to innovate too quickly. And that's the world that AI is moving us into. It's dramatically accelerating the pace of innovation.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you can quite clearly see kind of the link to the industrial age organization being very much top down. And I would assume that that's kind of the continuation of the argument. Can you elaborate? How does this impact the way that we organize work today?
Yeah. So we've been organizing businesses the same way since the 1850s. The first organizational chart was printed in 1855 by the New York and Erie Railroad. And there were several assumptions in 1855 that AI makes untrue. The first is that people did not, in general, have skill at making executive decisions. AI plus your average employee are going to be a dramatically better decision maker than most executives today. Two, that they didn't have context. Thomas Edison was involved in a train accident early in his career as a telegraph operator because there was an engineer who had the schedule for the trains, but his pocket watch was off by 4 minutes.
Mm.
That was all of the information they had to run, like, interstate, you know, nation level systems, like a pocket watch and a calendar. Um, with the world of AI, everybody has access to all of the information in the organization at the same time. Context changes. And then the third piece is because historically you didn't know what was going on or how to make decisions. It was very hard to think through what would be the second and third order impacts of the actions that you took. AI may or may not always give you the same answer, but it is excellent at helping you work through scenarios because that's what it does. It's a probability engine.
Mm.
And so every single person in your organization is going to have state level simulation systems in their pocket. And we aren't talking about in 2040. We're talking about in the next 2 years.
Wow. Yeah. It doesn't like, it's interesting. I do feel that we can all see this change on the horizon. Personally, and with the companies I work with, yet there's been no reorganization of a pivot towards aggressively more decentralized decision making, for example. Why do you think that is? Why is the lag so big?
Well, we've been talking about it, right? We've been talking about it for 20 years in academia. We've been showing the potential of these things. We've been talking about how to build psychologically safe organizations so that everybody
Mm.
can be more innovative. The problem is that leaders, they don't have, you know, information in real time about what's going on. And so giving up control is very dangerous.
Mm.
Uh, the amount of effort that goes into managing innovation is much higher than the amount of effort that goes into controlling, rationalized organizations. Um, and so there's a disinterest in doing it. The question to ask is, in a world where process after process, workflow after workflow starts to see automation in it,
Mm.
and that automation comes from junior people having an idea, that we need to rethink the innovation process, not because we need to be more innovative, but because the window in which you can monetize that innovation is about to shrink.
Why is that?
If you go back 25 years, we had strategy and then we had execution. We had freeze and
Mm.
thaw. Last 25 years has been about this idea of strategy, execution. We do both at the same time.
Mm.
In a world where your person can do what would be 3 days of work today in 45 minutes with AI. And there are examples I can give you of things we're doing where that is true. all of a sudden you have to do execution before you have a coherent strategy. And that's increasingly going to be the case. And so the reason we need to make this shift is that in order to get ahead of competition, in order to move at the speed of customers, we need to shift from strategy and then execution to strategy execution to this world of execution and then strategy. It's a wild thing to be thinking about.
Is strategy obsolete? Or what is the definition of strategy in that world?
Well, I think it's about organizational frame,
Okay.
you know,
Capabilities
the,
almost.
the capabilities that you can reorganize. And how do you think through that ability to reorganize the structure?
Mm,
Um, so I don't know that strategy goes away, but it becomes much more of a meta thing.
mm,
Is what are my cluster of assets and processes? What is my architecture as a firm? How do I build a culture that makes this all possible?
mm. How does this look in practice? So say that we fundamentally run a very fluid, innovation-focused, distributed in decision power organization. What does that look like? What roles are different? Are there managers? What do they do differently by that point?
So when you think about the middle manager today, the primary role is quality assurance, right? And process control. I think that continues, but it's a very different situation where it's not about so much designing the processes as dealing with the edge cases,
Mm,
right? Like if the processes are coherent, a lot of that's going to get automated. If the processes, if you have an information based business, um, the question to ask is really about that second piece. How do you deal with the edge cases? How do you become aware of it? How do you make sure they're getting bubbled up? How do you make sure that when people have a solution to it, that knowledge is distributed as quickly as possible?
mm.
Those, I think, are things we're under imagining, right? I don't think the role of the middle manager goes away, or the objective. I think the way you achieve it changes pretty radically.
And how do you achieve it? What's the everyday work day of a middle manager of the future?
Sure, I think it is making, like I said, making sure that those edge cases get bubbled up. I think they
Yeah.
have a lot more. Uh, they're dealing with a lot more process complexity. It's
Hmm.
easy to imagine a world where you might have a junior person that's not managing 1,000 people, but they're managing 1,000 AI bots.
Yeah.
You know, so the process complexity, of a junior manager, of a middle manager, might be the same as a GM today, right? And that's what
Mm.
we've got to be thinking about, is like, how do we train these people to think uh, at that level of complexity?
Yeah, it's fundamentally interesting. So if we assume that the employee level has the intelligence of a genius, that role changes a lot, and the capabilities of that role, and especially if you provide a lot of context, as you said. I think one of the things that's interesting with strategy is how can we leverage our unfair advantages. So that historically has been a lot about putting a lot of resources behind a few big bets and coherently
Mhm.
executing on those. Do you think that that won't be necessarily the way that strategy fundamentally works in the future? It's more about a gazillion micro bets in a distributed system, or how do you see that playing out?
I think it's probably different for every organization.
Yeah.
But what you know is that the architecture for making those micro bets, the corporate architecture is different, right? The
Mm,
corporate architecture for the processes for managing that range of uh, optionality is very different than, like you said, we're going to make one big bet. And the culture in which you do that, where you have, like, let's say, a 70% failure rate, that's very, very different.
mm. Yeah,
And it
absolutely.
looks a lot more like a research lab than it does, a paper factory.
Mm,
And got to start thinking about, okay, how do we bring these things together? And not just technically, right? How do we do the transformation, but culturally, right? How do we build a culture where we have that coherence, we have that consistency,
Mm.
right? But we're able and we're willing to take dramatically more risk because we have new ways to manage it.
Yeah, you talked about a rapid sensing system in the book.
Mm.
I would assume that ties into the ability to see risk and manage risk. Can you lay out the argument there?
One of the reasons why senior management holds on to control is because middle management doesn't pass the information through. You get this game of telephone where one person says one thing and another says another. By the time you get from the bottom to the top, black is white and red is blue. And so we need to have today that kind of process control in our organizations. But in a world where you can look down into whatever is going on, all of a sudden you can give up a lot of control because you don't need it to maintain command.
Mm.
When you look at the octopus, something really interesting happens, which is it's got the 8 tentacles out there, and they're all operating individually, and occasionally one eye will go and look at a tentacle, will take control of that tentacle
Mm.
for a few moments, try and go and get the fish or whatever it's trying to do. But the other 7 are operating on their own. And so how do we think about an organization where you can drop in with that level of precision, that level of control, and say, "There's something interesting over there. Let's focus on that."
Mm.
Um, it's a different way of thinking, right? But when you have access, when your junior person has access to all this information and all this ability to innovate, that means that you do too.
Mhm.
And so we need these rapid sensing systems that allow us to get ahead of the changes in the environment, right? That allow us to get ahead of, crazy ideas, um, and yet free people up to have them and execute against them.
If you've been listening to this podcast for some time, you know what I think about AI. I'm deeply excited about it, but I also see companies struggle with it. And you know that I think it's not primarily due to technical reasons. Compared to previous revolutions, let's call it the internet wave, part of why we struggled initially was that, well, the infrastructure wasn't built out. We didn't have online credit card payments and whatnot. But the difference with AI is that the infrastructure is already here. The technology is so much more capable than we actually use it right now. And the problem for most C-suites that I talk to, CEOs and senior managers, is that they know about the importance of AI, but they can't seem to get to that position where they truly understand how is AI making me fundamentally more competitive. I understand that it can save costs, hours here and there, increase some productivity number, but how do I distinguish myself on my market? Like the ones that truly survived the digitalization era wasn't a bookstore that got a website. It was the Amazons of the world. So where you truly find the transformation of what we do today and how can we unlock things, serve customers that we never could, do innovations that weren't ever before practical, that type of innovation. The primary problem that I see, in all honesty, is that the C-suite, you don't really understand the technology. And not understanding the technology for the sake of understanding the technology, but for the sake of having a strategic discussion. So that's why I started Brill. I stand right smack dab in the middle of I understand the technology, I understand strategy and execution. And bringing these two together is what we do at Brill. So if you understand that this is something that needs to happen, then we should talk. Thing is, slots for this spring is already filling up. Grail has been in the works for some time, so I've already have engagement for the spring. But what I'm looking for is that one CEO in each market that truly wants to make a dent in the universe. So if you're that guy or that girl, please head over to Grail, that works, and let's talk. What's the timeline, do you think, where this will play out? The winners and the losers will become apparent?
It's a bit of a challenge to say, but I think there's this conversation about, well, AI hasn't paid out in
Yeah,
like what
exactly. 95% of pilots, et
like
cetera, et cetera.
yeah, but like that study that we're talking about from MIT, there's methodological issues with it.
Yeah.
But the second thing is this technology is evolving so quickly. Depending on how you calculate it, it's improving by about 7 times a year. And there's every reason to think the next few years that will continue. And I think out to the next 5, it's a pretty good bet. So we're talking about, like, conservatively, these technologies getting 30 times better than they are today, 32 times better than they are
Mm.
today, right? And I don't think organizations are really considering, like you said, what happens with an employee plus AI. You've got 1,000 Einsteins in your organization,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's probably not a good idea to tell Einstein what to invent.
But it's also exciting because it makes
Or
fundamentally
that,
what are the problems that we could tackle? Because I see a lot of companies mostly slapping AI onto existing legacy processes and win some 5-10% productivity gain within a specific department. But you fundamentally do the same thing that you did yesterday, just more efficiently. I think that
yeah,
will just the market would factor that in, and then there's a new price floor that's just expected in the pricing, and like what did that actually get you? But what's more exciting to me is like all of the things that didn't make economic sense before, but suddenly they do,
yeah,
right?
yeah. And I think that's the fascinating thing that you know we're going to see. I think at the back half of 2026, some economic value. There's going to be not like Klarna goes out there and has some edge
Mm.
case like we're getting all AI, but like larger organizations start to see some success. 2028, 2029, you start to see the measurable economic value. I think that's probably about what it looks like. And maybe I'm off by a year, right? But I don't think anybody's who's serious is looking out at 2035 and thinking the world isn't fundamentally different, and
Mm.
that the economy and money system aren't fundamentally different. So that's kind of maybe answers some of the question for you about how long. But the next question is about, what would you do differently?
Yeah.
When I think of, a company like Lovable, $100 million ARR in 8 months. You think they're operating their sales organization like you are yours?
Mm. Yeah, I met them when
They
I was
got
in San Francisco, when I was trying to have this conversation live with you, and you ended up going to Mexico. But yeah, it's super exciting. They fundamentally play a different game. But it's also interesting because they've built it from the ground up in this new logic. Like most of, at least this audience that we're speaking to, are not in that position. They have all of the legacy processes and all of the staff that are trained and skilled within that set of processes, right?
and this is the challenge,
Yeah.
right? Is it's a heart transplant,
Yeah.
um, on a live patient. And so the question really is, how do we do this? And I think that if you're serious about it and you think about shifting an architecture, you do an M&A, right? And you want to shift the corporate architecture, bring new people in. That's like a 2-year political process to
Mm.
do that, right? Consultants will say it's 90 days, right? But it's like 2 years, right? Just to get all the right people in the right place. If you want to bring in SAP or Oracle or shift out a major business function, it's about a 3-year process, right? It's a year to plan it, a politic it, a year to do it, a year to fix everything you just broke. No one has ever disagreed with those numbers, by the
Nobody
way.
who's gone through the transformation of bringing on SAP.
And they're like, you're being conservative. The shift of a culture, though, there are people like Benham Tabrizi who say, hey, you can do this in 90 days or 6 months. My experience has been that you need to raise up or put out every single leader in the organization. Right? And that's typically about a 7-year process to churn an entire C-suite.
Mm.
That's the world that we're talking about. And so if you believe that in 2030, the world's fundamentally different in terms of how it operates, 2032, you pick your number.
It doesn't
The
really
question,
matter.
the question is, when are you going to start doing the culture change? Because you have
Yeah.
time to do the other stuff, but you don't have time to do the culture shift
Mm.
if you want to compete with the lovable in your industry.
Mm. What's the first step? Say that you're the CEO of a mid-market company, $2 billion revenue. What are the steps that you actually begin with?
I think, like I said, it starts with the culture side. And in the academy, we've kind of come up with a number of things that innovative organizations tend to do more of. We did a study of 2.7 million managers about why some are more lucky in times of change than others.
Mm.
It turns out it's not chance, right? We all know this. There's always somebody in our lives who always lands on their feet.
Yeah.
What are they doing differently?
Mm.
And if we want our junior people to be more innovative and think like senior leaders earlier in their career, how do we teach them how to do that? Right.
Yes.
And it comes down to four things. They leverage help from their peers more than their peers. They make more unexpected connections. They are more socioeconomically connected to a range of people in economic strata. They're more connected across industry. This is really important because as a senior leader, you probably do some of this, right? You ask for a lot more help from your peers. Maybe you're in a mastermind. Maybe you're at the golf club, but you're always listening and leveraging.
Mm.
The second thing is that you're out at the golf club. You're always listening and leveraging, right? You're broadening that connectivity. To date, we've had our people focused on their computer screens, working harder, 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 harder. That's still important. But one of the things we need to do is think about, okay, well, how do we get our people out of the office? How do we get our
Yeah.
people out of their context? How do we get their people out of their comfort zone? Because that's where your potential increases, not like 3% a year, but 30, 300, right? It's
Mm.
those break moments that senior leaders are good at because they are in that broader context. The third thing is about controlling chaos. Standard operating procedures, statistical process controls, work in situations where there are processes that are consistent enough to manage statistically.
Yeah.
World I'm talking about, and the world of senior leaders, man, it's all edge cases all the time.
Mm.
And the challenge is, how do you enable more junior people to think from a first principles perspective, right? About what is this risk? What is this challenge? How am I going to innovate against it? How am I going to manage this downstream impacts? These are senior level ways of thinking.
Mm.
We need to get that. If the people more junior are going to be dealing with more process complexity, we need to get that down into our organizations much earlier in career. And then the last piece is taking the time to know what's missing. Right? As a senior leader, having an instant opinion is often a terrible idea, right? What you do if you want to get breadth in the decision making is you do not say things until the end,
Mm.
right? The time to listen, to diagnose, to think about what's not there, to think about what's missing. And so they take the time to know what's missing. So they leverage help, unexpected connections, they control chaos, and they know what's missing. That leads to a really convenient acronym, luck.
Yeah.
It also provides a really simple way to start thinking about, okay, well, how do I help this person think like a more senior leader today?
There's an interesting opportunity to develop if you're a leadership training company or if you're a large company to develop your own kind of training agents for this. So I have this interesting case that I'm building out now for one company. So you capture. So this would be it's a consultancy company, so it would be for their sales staff and for their advisory staff. So we capture transcripts. And besides just making the follow-ups and all of that stuff that the tools do out of the box, we also run the transcripts through a specific set of analyses looking for specifically that. What would be the feedback of a manager, for example? And then we automatically ping the salesperson or the advisor with like feedback afterwards. So I
Right.
think there's opportunity to kind of build these systems where we scale the training of these new second
Okay.
order or first principle thinking or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's the only way to do it because the reality, one of the reasons why we don't superpower our staff is that, if you're a middle manager and you're already working 40, 50 hours a week and you've got
Mm.
50 people, well, putting an hour a week into each of those people is your entire job. But putting 3 hours a week of AI into those people,
Yeah,
that's one of those
exactly.
things we don't do today, right? Just because the economics don't make sense.
It's funny.
And
This
that
idea actually came from I have a sales director friend. He
oh,
came up with this original idea based on the concept I want to be less in meetings. But how can I kind of provide the value that I would normally do in a meeting, but more automated?
right. Well, when I was a middle manager, I was spending 65% of my time in alignment meetings.
Yeah.
And like that's just think about that. That wasn't even my job description.
No.
It was the majority of my work. It
Yeah.
was absolutely insane. And when I would explain this to my boss, he'd be like, "Well, that's just the way it is."
Mm. I think I read a study that said 74 in large companies, 74% of time goes to meetings and only 20% of those meetings are perceived as valuable.
Mm.
Like if we talk
I
about
would
the future of work and like what do we need to fix and what does this brave new world look like with AI, like that's square in the middle of what I want to stop doing as my job description, sitting on Zoom meetings and having boring non-value creating meetings.
absolutely.
What do you see the kind of big consultancy firms? Obviously, they're building up massive AI transformation offices and so forth, the McKinseys and so forth. What are they doing right at this moment and what's kind of missing in the market?
I think it's about, the first thing is the culture change, right?
Yeah.
There's the piece that you can do yourself. There's the piece that requires someone to come in from the outside.
Mm,
Um, I think that's going to be really important. The second piece is that the way we've done digital transformations to date is that there's some person at the top who has an opinion, and there's a whole bunch of people at the bottom who have to deal with the outcomes of that
mm,
implementation. And like this is the thing that blows me away, right? Companies like Accenture say, hey, there's 70, 85% failure rate on these things we do.
yeah.
Think about that. Their job is to be like, we're going to be successful. And they're saying that like the edge case is that these things are successful.
Mm.
Um, the reason I think is often that top down transformation doesn't work. At the end of the day, it's the people at the bottom that need to use the tools.
Yeah, I think it's a continuing pattern. So what we saw, I feel a lot around the digital transformations is that you approach it as a technical problem where
Mhm.
it's fundamentally mostly a human problem and it's just an amplified effect now with AI. I see the same
Yeah.
thing. You try to hire a chief AI officer to delegate the problem, right? Not understanding
Mhm.
that fundamentally your whole business, your whole culture, your whole organization needs to change.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. This isn't a technological problem; it's a sociological problem.
Mm,
Uh, the within that, the questions are, about how we actually do that, right? How do we actually make this shift, and what do we insource? What do we outsource? At the end of the day, what's interesting about AI is that because of the rate of change, it's the junior people who are going to find the opportunities if you let them. And as a senior leader, you can look down into the organization and see where the opportunities are in real time and help them scale up.
mm,
Right. So we're inverting the process pyramid, right? From one that's top down to one that's bottom up. And that's a shift, right? Because Senior leaders don't want to give up control. This is very scary.
Mm.
This is what I've been doing the last 20 years, is becoming a good decision maker. Um, and the junior people are suddenly going to be saying, but I can do it now.
Yeah.
I've got the skills. Why aren't you delegating? Right? Is that sociological challenge of being willing to allow your people to innovate on your behalf and accept the failure rates, accept the challenges, try and find ways to make people more comfortable with the uncertainty and
Mm.
the fear that comes with taking risk. And
I,
that's your job as a leader today.
I completely agree. And if we assume it's correct, and I completely agree with that, I think it's correct. It's a human problem. It's a sociological problem. Part of what I think we're underinvesting in as managers right now is we need the storytelling of not what are we building, but who are we becoming. That's like, what
Mhm.
are we aiming for? That positive mental image of this is how it looks for you, the whatever level employee, when you go to work in 2-3 years, and getting that to an exciting place to want to come towards, right?
Right,
And I
right.
see very little of that type of storytelling. I see the kind of 6 months storytelling right now. What I'm talking about is kind of the 3-year vision of where are we then?
Yeah. And I think and what, like you said, like, what role do you play?
Mm,
Um, I was talking with Amy Edmondson a while back. So she's the woman who coined the term psychological safety.
mm,
And she said, here's the thing. People will do almost anything with you if they know that we're in this together.
mm,
And the challenge, the story that I hear is, hey, executive assistants are going away, customer support is going away, blah, 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 blah. I'm not sure they completely believe it. There's not a lot of evidence that there's a lot of job reduction. There's certainly going to be a lot of task automation. There's,
yeah,
to automate a job, you need to automate all the tasks. There's not a lot of evidence that's going to happen quickly. So, we're going to figure out where the value is in the people we have and the jobs we do. But we're going to be reallocating time
mm,
for the next several years. And so, like, the story about, okay, well, what does that look like? How do you do more? How do you be more effective? How do we create a world where you're getting out of the office
mm,
instead of being stuck in the cubicle, right? How do we create a world where uh, people are more collaborative, you know, and people are having more fun together? Um, how do we create a world where you have more autonomy?
mm,
And these are things that I personally happen to value a lot.
mm.
Um, it's going to be a challenge oftentimes convincing other people to value them. But we do need to tell that story of there's a place for you if you want to play the game.
Yeah. I've
It's
talked to innovators in the past that has brought up an interesting kind of intersection between the value of play and
Mhm.
innovation. Have you looked at this?
Mhm. Tell me more.
So the core idea is that, so if you think about it from the perspective of improv theater, for example, uh,
Yeah.
there's this very playful but also extremely creative and innovative way of kind of telling that story and building something together. But it only works if
Mhm.
we're fundamentally collaborating in the kind of playful environment. And what
Mhm.
happens when companies go through a lot of change is that they don't feel that they have the resources or the time to be kind of playful with it. Everything feels life and death. So you start to decrease the amount of playfulness that you have in your kind of in culture, which is the exact opposite of what you probably should do. And I think this connects probably to your being fine with that. Many of the experiments that will run will probably not lead anywhere, but the few that do will be game changing. And it's coming back to this idea of the culture change is at the kind of
Yeah.
epicenter of being successful or not.
I completely agree with everything you're saying. You know, and it's as a manager, it's really easy to look at like, okay, well, how do I make sure that all of this experimentation rolls up into anything bigger, right? How do I make
Mm,
sure that all of this innovation, in all of these different business groups roll up to something bigger, right? That's part of your job is, to make sure you have visibility into what's happening so that you can give up control.
mm,
Because at the end of the day, you still are responsible for that. That's your
mm,
core responsibility is make sure that these small pieces turn into a bigger whole. It's just a lot less telling people what those pieces should be.
mm.
And that's the shift. So I think the first thing is, yes, a lot more play, a lot more experimentation, a lot more creativity. We've talked before about this concept called Triz. This is a weird germ,
Love
Russian
that. It was so
Russian.
interesting. Yeah, go for it.
So there's this Russian engineer, I think, mathematician engineer, who came up with this. He basically came up with every way to have a new idea and like every pattern for solving problems. And the problem is you have to be a very, very on the spectrum Russian mathematician engineer to use this thing. The thing is that the AI makes it really easy. It's called Triz, Triz. And you ask it to be an expert at Triz and help me innovate, think through this problem. What are the challenges? How would I think through it? What are the workflows? And it turns out that it's incredibly good creative partner, play partner that helps almost anybody be dramatically more effective. And it's just sitting there
Yeah.
inside of OpenAI or inside of Claude from Anthropic or any of these tools to be there, to be that partner with you. And it's that experimentation with these tools about not how do they answer questions for us, but how do they help us ask better ones? How do they help us structure our questions so that they're more creative and useful?
Yeah,
And
and it's
that's I
so
think
interesting. I read that in your book, and I highlighted it when I read it through because that's really at the epicenter of what I tend to do with my AI anyway, help me work through problems and so forth. But I've never fundamentally felt that AI has come up with their own ideas. It's been, and I've heard so many people say the same thing, that AI isn't fundamentally creative. And this framework was the first time, so I tried it a week and a half ago. So I walked through, this was in Claude. I felt it worked a lot better in Claude than in ChatGPT 5, the Sonnet 4.5 model. So I kind of prompted the model to really understand the ecosystem of the problem that I was trying to solve, and then asked it to apply the TRIS framework. And it was the first
Mhm.
time that I genuinely felt that I get new things that I haven't read about somewhere else, that I haven't thought about myself. That was a game changer for me. It was so valuable.
for me, that's been really powerful. The other thing is to ask it to look for metaphors or similar things in deep history, right?
Mm,
I want how is this how have situations like this played out in the Ottoman Empire right now? Like, right, because there's all of that knowledge is
mm,
there.
mm,
You just need to look at it from a different context.
mm.
And that's the human element at this point. I think the other piece, in terms of these tools, because we're talking about the tools, is if you are using the free version of these tools and they're improving it like 7 times a year, you're probably using a 2-year-old technology. The
Yes.
better stuff, like, is like an order of magnitude better. And so you have this world where people are having very different experiences
Mm,
of what they think are the same thing,
mm.
right? One's having, uh, a Wagyu steak and one's having gristle. And they're both having steak. It's like, that's not
Yeah.
true.
Yeah, I agree. Who are, do you think, going to be the real winners from a financial perspective within the coming 5 years, let's say? Is it going to be the OpenAIs and the Claudes and or Anthropics, or is it more your average company, or aren't there going to be real winners here?
So I think everyone's gonna have to play the game. And I don't know because the transformation is gonna be so quick that you gain massive strategic advantage. Right? I think it'll be highly tactical advantage in many cases. The in terms of like, does OpenAI ever make money? The foundational challenge is that the value of frontier models, the most advanced models, are dropping at about 90% a year. So, move that out 2 years, 99% price
Mm.
performance drop. Well, that name an industry that has been able to sustain a 99% price performance drop in 24 months.
Hmm.
Like, it's going to be very hard to monetize the models. That said, they may be very sticky. They may lock you into
Mm.
all sorts of other things. And that's where it gets really interesting is can they lock you into services? Can they lock you into data centers? Can they lock you into specific silicon? Can they lock you into long-term service agreements, right? Like, these are things that companies like Oracle, SAP,
Mm.
they're really good at.
Mhm.
Um, and are those agreements in your interest? So I think that's challenge number one. Is I'm not sure that the models are where the money is. The second question that you were asking is, do I, as a small mid cap business, benefit? I think that there's the short term of I can cost reduce, I can get rid of some labor, so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's your people that are going to be doing the innovation. And
Mm.
I don't know that drop the people gets you more innovation. I'm
Mm.
not saying it doesn't, but the question is, in a world where we're executing faster than strategy, how how do you do that? How do you put the governance processes in place that allow that to happen? How do you operate much more like a research lab than like a paper factory?
Can we
And
take the
just
research lab analogy? Because one thing that's really interesting is that we have started to see junior roles not necessarily disappearing, but not being recruited that much because that's the first level stuff that's easy to automate, right?
well, the people think it's easy to automate. We'll see if it is.
It's easy to automate the what 80% of the time where you don't have an exception, and the other staff can do the exceptions. I think is the primary bet, and you still do the exceptions through some type of human in the loop design. Uh, but in a research lab, if you kind of play it out, what if you don't hire junior employees? Over a period of years, you won't have any like mid-level people. There's no growth from underneath. So I'd be interested in how do you deal with junior research lab assistants and what kind of role do they fill in a research lab? And can we learn anything from that perhaps?
They fill a creative role, right? So they're having new and different ideas in a lot of cases. It depends on the type of laboratory. But a lot of times their job is to have the crazy ideas because they don't understand what won't work.
Oh, okay.
And that's actually highly valuable in a world where new things will work every week because new
Yeah,
technology makes it
exactly.
possible.
Mm.
And so, you know, it's going to be incredibly important. Mark Zuckerberg, famously said at some point, I don't hire anyone over 27. And he's like snotty 27-year-old, right? He's hiring a lot more people over 27 now. But there's some insight in that it's actually that regeneration and the friction that comes with people not knowing what they're doing that
And if
makes
we,
new things possible.
yeah, that's super interesting. And if we go to the other side of the spectrum, could we argue that the old grizzled, experienced executives that we expect them more to move towards almost like being the guardians of the wisdom, being guardians of values and long-term thinking and so forth? Or is that not a argument to make? They need to be as innovative as the young ones.
I think that they need to open up the innovation.
Mm.
They need to make it possible. I do think that I'm certainly starting to be of an age where I'm the gristled one, so I have an interest in this argument. But I think that the most effective innovation executives, right? They're people like Mickey McManus, who I really enjoy. Um, he talks about this idea of uh, reverse internships.
Hmm.
So he would take a junior employee and he'd say, "Okay, here's the deal. Here's the product. What do we need to do? And let me help you do it. I'm
Hmm.
not going to tell you what to do or how it'll work, but I can unlock things for you, and you lead."
Have you tried that?
And
That sounds interesting.
so Mickey's done this. And what he said was, I didn't think the project was going to work, and it did.
Hmm.
You know, like you're going to discover that there's this entirely new ways of looking and thinking and working,
Hmm.
um, that are not intuitive because of how we grew up. I grew up in a world where you had a pen and paper and you made a list. And if you got that list wrong, you got to rewrite the entire list.
Yeah.
And we're now moving in, out of the cut and paste, computer world into I don't even write the list.
Yeah.
I just get a list and I'm like, I don't like that one. Bring me another one. Bring me
Hmm.
another one.
Hmm.
Right? Like different cognitive world than the one we grew up in. And so we need to just kind of like assume that there are strengths in what we know how to do, but there are also weaknesses because we spent so much time getting good at those things. So how do
Hmm.
we allow our people to lead?
How do you personally work with your chats? Like, what are the things that you find yourself coming back to a lot?
There are a couple of things, right? One, we have this tool called Deep Invent that helps. We're automating the research lab, and what it does is it has a conversation with you. It helps you identify the shape of that invention that you're interested in, market opportunities, collaborators, looks at all of the intellectual property that's ever been filed, all the scientific literature that's ever been written, and then says, hey, here are 10 ideas. We don't know if they're good inventions or not, but why don't you dig into one? And
Hmm.
our tool our agent will have a conversation with you, help you shape it up, and then press a button, and all of a sudden it's written a patent filing for you.
Hmm.
Um, what's interesting to me is that was a 6-month process before, and now it's a 45-minute process.
Hmm.
And it was a $500,000 problem before, and now it's a $1 problem.
Hmm.
And like in that is, I think, how we need to start thinking about these tools is that they might do things for us, but they help us be dramatically more innovative.
Hmm.
And they remove parts of the process that were so expensive that we often didn't do it before, right? We
Yeah.
didn't file in IP as mid-cap companies before. I know that, software
Hmm.
companies especially, because it was just too time consuming. It distracted people.
Hmm.
And
Agree.
now if it's easy, it doesn't necessarily have to be good. There just needs to be enough of it that you're defended.
What's the role of patents moving forward? Like that rule set seems a little bit built for a world where innovation was both more expensive. So, like, if you spent half a year and $2 million innovating something, I think everybody would be fine with you getting some exclusivity on it. If you spent 45 minutes on it and you have some type of worldwide or US patent on it, I don't know if that kind of system still makes sense. It's the first time I'm thinking about it. I think you've thought more about it.
The In the US, the concept, and this is where things break down. Right? The concept is that it's not about sweat of the brow. It's about the quality of the insight.
Mm.
And that's what we patent for. And so actually, from a legal perspective, the fact that you spent $2 million in 6 months is completely irrelevant to the value of the intellectual property. So that's the first thing to be thinking about here. The second is, um, how do you use it? Because they're so expensive, we tend to use patents defensively. What is really interesting is if for $50,000 I can file a whole suite of IP that acts as a moat against your competition, just completely blocks them in.
Mm.
That's really interesting, and no one did that before. Basically, everybody's a patent troll.
Yeah.
Um, that's a weird world, right?
Yeah,
That's a
you would
weird world to be.
assume that there's. I'm almost exclusively speaking about like moral issues here, not really the practicality. But you would then almost want to force you to do something about it because we don't want to create pockets of innovation that are protected by patents but are not realized because we have so many ideas and we can patent so easily, right?
Mm. There's still effort that goes into realizing it. The
Yeah, yeah.
issue is we have a concept called first to file.
Okay.
So the first person to file intellectual property has priority on it. That doesn't mean you pursue it. Later stages in the patent process get more expensive.
Okay.
Um, but it gives you something to stake a claim in if you want to go further.
Mm.
And I think that's really important. Um, the second piece is that, and this is what concerns me, is that part of the reason that the patent office isn't completely overwhelmed, and they're stunningly overwhelmed, is because it is an expensive pain in the neck process. What happens when the patent office gets completely overwhelmed and all of a sudden we go from a 3 or 5 year window for receiving a patent grant to a 10-year window, or
Mm.
on a
Yeah.
window on a 20-year piece of IP, right? That's a very realistic situation we could find ourselves in. The second thing that we could find ourselves in is that something like 3/4 of patents, and I'm making that number up, but it's in that range, turned out to not be defensible.
Mm. But I would assume that the
That's kind of
patent offices would be really good customers for Deep Invent as well, but just from applied from the other direction.
yes, indeed.
That's fantastic. Part of the
Absolutely.
game plan. What excites you the most if you're looking into the next, let's say, 2 years?
I think this is a slightly different shift, but I think it's what's happening around AI across Asia.
Okay.
That, in the US and in Europe, we have this US Euro perspective, right? But what's actually happening on the planet is that the size of the US European middle class is like increasing by 50% in the next decade or so. And that's not happening in Italy. It's not happening in California. That's happening across China, Indonesia,
Mm.
India, Thailand. And that's the most exciting thing to me in human history. How are we going to use AI to make all of that possible? How are we going to use it to decrease resource use? How are we going to use it to increase efficiency so that people are freeing their time to be more useful and productive to our species? The way we do that is going to be defined in the next couple of years.
Mm.
Um, Big conversations, the positive conversation that we're not having yet.
Mm. I know that Mo Gavdat, the ex-chief Google X officer, wrote a lot about AI as well. He has this mental image of in a few years' time where at a beach somewhere, either hiding from the robots or completely set free by the robots. Where are you on the? What's your take on how this will play out for civilization?
Slower than everybody says and faster than we can imagine.
Mm.
Um, I think, foundationally, we need to get dramatically more efficient, like orders of magnitude more efficient. if billions of people are going to live the lifestyle that you and I have been gifted.
Yeah.
I think that is our moral obligation as a species. Uh, and AI is the single best tool we have to find efficiencies in every business process, every production process, every service process on the planet. And unleashing that is transformational to history.
Mm.
And it's the biggest meteor that's certainly hit the earth in my lifetime, maybe ever.
And it's interesting because we're only really talking about AI a lot right now, but we also have this convergence of a lot of other technologies that are equally potentially impactful. If we talk about new sources of energy, if we talk about quantum computing, if we talk about biomedicine and precision medicine and gene folding and whatnot, there's a lot of things happening. Robotics, let's not forget. There's a lot of things converging in a 10-year period that has
Yeah,
huge potential impact. How do you see kind of these things playing out together also?
that's a big question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are two questions within that. One is, what are the rich world problems? And, precision medicine, blah, 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 blah. Very exciting. On the other hand, I think there's one brain surgeon for every 400,000 Indians, 4
Mm,
million Indians, like that. I think there are much more basic things that are less sexy, like how do people not die of brain aneurysms,
mm,
that we need to figure out how to solve. And so there are these two sides of this coin, right? There's the cool VCable thing, right? VC fundable thing. And then there's the thing that actually changes millions or billions of lives. And I think we're undercalculating that. We're under investing that. Um, how do we dramatically shift with robotics, for instance? The fact that there's a lack of brain surgeons,
mm,
right? And how do we make those robots not $1 million? How do we make them 10,000? How do we make them $100,000? Right? Those are the really interesting things to me. Um, when we talk about foundationally precision medicine and quantum computing, what we're talking about is an ability to simulate what happens next, right? The thing that's scary today, the thing that's terrifying today, whether it's climate, whether it's geopolitics, whether it's looking at potential disruptions in the financial system. The thing that's terrifying today is that this is the first time in human history that we have had any tools to look into the future and look in a meaningful way at the range of what's happened,
mm,
the range of what's going to happen, and make decisions. What's terrifying is we now have a responsibility for the future that we
mm,
never did,
mm,
which means we have so much more potential,
mm,
that so much more is possible, that we can dream bigger for the first time in human history. And that's what quantum computing, that's what AI, that's what the ability to simulate so that we can do things like precision medicine are all about. It's a different way of thinking. It's about thinking not as uh, vassals of fate,
mm.
but the creators of it.
Yeah. I had an interesting conversation with an AI professor here in Sweden talking about AI doesn't work that well yet in uh, research settings because it's a lot about correlations, but you're looking for causations. But it's coming up as well. Have you been looking at this at all?
So we've been working on artificial intelligence tools for 75 years now, something like that, right? 1956 was, I think, when we coined the term. Uh, my point being that there's a whole range of what's called symbolic reasoning, which is kind of left brain AI. So this is stuff where A always goes to B always goes to C. If you were around in the 90s, we called them expert systems. If you've used TurboTax, that's what we're talking about. Right? You don't want your accountant to sometimes think it's a dollar. Like, but when 1,000 times is a billion, right? Like, so we've built a lot of those tools, symbolic reasoning tools. And then we've had these neural networks that we've been building for the last 15 years. This is what Jeff Hinton got uh, his Nobel Prize for. This is what OpenAI is built on top of. And, sometimes things are one, sometimes they're two.
Mm.
Very occasionally they're 367, right? Good for correlation, not so good for causation. And,
Mm.
and the big project, so I think of it as like kind of left brain and right brain thinking.
Mm.
Uh, the big challenge in computer science over the next 5 years is bringing those together to kind of a whole mind way of thinking so that you are looking at correlation, right? Creative stuff. You're also looking at causation. A always goes to B, always goes to C.
Mm.
And what we're seeing is we're getting much better at this with things like reasoning models, right? With things um, with reinforcement learning tools. And like we're getting much better at it. And foundationally, what's happening is we're building out work plans that are much more granular. Let's
Mm.
look at this little million times. Let's look at this little piece a million times. Let's look at this little piece a million times. And what are the answers that we see most consistently? And so you're getting those two things, right? A always goes to B always goes to C. And then you're testing it. It's called best of N
Mm.
a whole bunch of times to see what is the most true thing here, right? And so the question isn't really correlation and causation. It's how do you get granular enough and how do you test things enough that it doesn't actually matter?
Yeah, how can you actually start simulating outcomes? That's really interesting, and getting high precision in simulation work. Uh, I don't think people really understand the concept of let's do that a million times. Just in I heard like half a year ago, something like that, just in a marketing example, what if you fundamentally could ask every single one of your customer, but they're just simulated when you're building up your new marketing campaign? We
Sure.
we like we don't design, or I haven't designed processes for that type of like, let's run that specific single variate thing a million times. That's so exciting what you can do.
And this comes down to that conversation we were having at the beginning about like what would you do
Mm.
if you had, we were I think we were talking about this before. Like what would you do if you had an infinite amount of labor or an
Yeah.
infinite amount of choices or an infinite amount of time?
Mm.
Like these are the questions. They're bizarre questions, but they're the questions we need to be asking,
But I think it's
right?
such a fundamentally great way of looking at it. So I have conversations very much more practical than this conversation that we're having today. Like, what's the first custom GPTs that I should build? Like that type of entry level into GPT. I think that's a great way to start. Like, imagine you had unlimited support staff around you. What would they
Mhm,
do? What could they do
mhm,
that would fundamentally delight your customers in ways that you couldn't possibly do today just because of time constraints? Awesome place
right.
for like simple innovation. I actually built a couple of those types of like deep research flows just around that idea.
Mhm, mhm. What did you discover?
So for me, so I was looking at my role as a leader. So what would be the support staff that I would love as a leader? So I found that I would love a management consultant around me that was constantly monitoring the external environment.
Mhm,
That was quality and improver of plans that I laid. So how does this
mhm,
actually connect, align, stuff like that? There was a lot around just executive assistant stuff,
mhm,
summarize, yada yada. A lot about what we talked about before, the kind of one-to-one coachings. Prepare,
mhm,
be there when I'm not, give feedback even though I never really touched it.
mhm,
So there were a bunch of I think the framework of breaking a role down to the individual tasks is really helpful in the practical sense. Because the reality of most leaders is that you're a leader, but that's not everything that you do 100%. You're also a sales guy or a IT guy or whatever it is. But just break the IT part of your role down into individual tasks. How can we improve the speed of UX discoveries or whatever it might be? Break it down to tasks, automates that stuff. But also, I think what fascinated me most with that work was also thinking through, what do I fundamentally enjoy doing, and rig me up so that I'm better positioned to do that with better quality. So generating awesome pre-reads, for example, going in and have them automatically pop up in my Slack 5 minutes before the meeting. This is who you're meeting. This is what you talked about last time. These are things that you could bring that that person probably would find valuable, and just have it always just pop up 5 minutes before.
I want that.
Yeah. And it's not that difficult either to build. That's what's interesting right now. Again, the problem is not technological at this point.
No, it's not. It's having the idea that I don't need to do that work anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And I think compared to when the internet wave came, like, I think part of the reason why we saw that play out and we had a few bubbles and so forth along the way was there was so much infrastructure that wasn't fundamentally in place for an Amazon to work in the early stages of the internet revolution, because we didn't have smooth online payments, for example. We had to build that first. What I feel now with AI is that the infrastructure works so much better than the organization works around the infrastructure. So we can grow so much without really being constrained by the technical issues.
It's just, we're moving into such a wild time.
Yeah.
It's just, I remember how many years it took me to remember to ask Google first before I thought about a problem. Like, you should just ask Google. Someone thought about the problem.
Yeah.
And and then it was like, how do I ask the right question? How do I ask the question that will get the answer? Now, like, you don't really need to have the question or the answer. It'll get you like 80% of the way there. We're now moving into a world where where it's like, you don't even need that, right? Like, something will actually think about the problem in your context for you. And
Yeah.
how do we remember to do that? And how do we, in a world where we outsource our thinking, right, not get rolled by the system?
100%. So interesting. One of the things that I found is that when we talk about, I want to optimize for things that I enjoy, I really enjoy asking questions and being curious. So that was part of the design. Like, I really love iterating with my AIs or whatnot. And I think it's super dangerous if you're walking down the path of trying to automate your own thinking. Like, the second order consequences of that are poor. And we're starting to see brain studies coming out. So how do you specifically think about the idea of having mental friction as an important part of you being continuously creative?
I think that there's this idea, like, the thing that strikes me, and you may be in a slightly younger generation, but the thing that strikes me is, as an inventor growing up, probably the most critical component was boredom.
Yeah.
I'd be bored and I'd have to come up with something to do. And it was typically like blowing something up. Like, I'm not saying that my parents were into this, but like, it was typically a bad idea. And, and, but in that boredom was the moment where something new happened. The concern for me about friction, creative friction, is we are so overstimulated in every moment of the day. And we never, ever, ever are bored,
Mm.
ever. And so, how do you, in fact, create that space where innovation happens,
Yeah.
as opposed to, like, structural innovation happens, as opposed to just process, like, we're going to do this 4% better. There's a new way, there's a new button.
Mm.
How do we step back, and how do we encourage people who we've been just running harder and harder and harder on the hamster wheel to be comfortable doing that?
Yeah,
So
100%.
the critical thing is, like, in a world where technology makes new things possible every day, like, are we even solving the right problem any longer?
Mm. Yeah, and the ways that we look at productivity and measure productivity is also pretty part of the problem. You measure it by, you can see that people are online on Slack, which is probably the worst way of looking at productivity, but I see a lot of companies being very stingy about that.
Yeah, and I think it's also, are you looking for base hits or home runs,
Mm.
right? Are you looking for, to score a goal or to win the game? And there are different ways of thinking,
Mm.
right? There are different types of thinkers. And what we're looking for increasingly is if we empower our people, are new ways to win the game, not new ways to score goals.
Mm.
Like, how do you change the rules?
Yeah.
Reinvent, right? As a speaker, it's been really interesting for me in the last year or so that 2 years ago, 80%, 70% of my work would come through agents. Now it's just coming direct. People are like, yeah, I don't have time for that. I'm just going to
Mm.
call Jonathan, see if he can be in Brazil on Tuesday.
Mm.
which is just wild, right? But it's changed the game, right? If I was spending all of my time marketing to service, speakers bureaus, as opposed to being out there and being useful and having useful conversations,
Mm.
like, I wouldn't be hitting my new customer.
Yeah. Do you reflect on, coming back to the point that we were talking about before with mental friction? Do you design and optimize your life for those periods of boredom?
Yeah, I mean, I have I'm today on a workcation in Spain. And yeah, just making, I'm hanging out with a buddy and making time to really think about my business
Mm.
and think about what I need to do in the next year. Like, what in a world of such rapid growth, that's the most important thing,
Yeah.
right?
That's
Is to know where we're going instead of just running.
Yeah. Taking that step back. I completely agree. And so it
So
can
when
be
we were
very
talking,
difficult to get there in the kind of busyness of all things, right? You need to consciously make those choices.
yeah, you can't, like, you were saying earlier, does strategy go away?
Mm.
Strategy becomes dramatically more important.
Mm. Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for taking the time. This has been a really interesting conversation to me.
The same to me. Thank you very much.
And there, we're at the end of the episode. I think it's so amazing that almost 70% of you actually listen to the end of the episodes, especially for long format. I'm so thankful for that. Like, the engagement numbers is fantastic. Before we leave each other, two things. First off, this episode was sponsored by Grail, and I'll make no secret about Grail is the company that I'm starting. So it's the future of AI, and how can we unlock value that's not just automation, but actually building towards a future that we want to live in, like a future where I want to work, augmentation. So head over to grail.works to know more. Secondly, I'd appreciate so much that you listen to this podcast, but even though 70% listen to the end, almost 70% are not subscribed either. So if you can give a like button, subscribe to all my channels. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Instagram, we're on TikTok apparently. We have an awesome webpage, and there's so much more content, like, yes, the reels and so forth, but what I really would like to push for is that every week I publish a long format article, which is the pinnacle of my thinking. So it's the most interesting thing that I come across that week, either in podcasts or in other endeavors. And I try to write about it towards you, a senior leader. Like, what is the crucial takeaway from the most important part of my week, let's say. I publish that on LinkedIn and on my webpage, thinkroompodcast.com. Thank you so much, and see you next time.